Okay, so I thought I would just make a short-ish video on how to get across the spike pit in YU2 Mega Man 2 without using items or weapons. You do have to use one right at the end of the screen, but you can get past the majority of the spike pit without having to use any. So I'm just going to play a recording I made earlier. And just talk you through some of the sort of key aspects of nailing the strat. And I would say, I've probably done it 6 or 7 times now, but it's not easy at all. I still find it really difficult to do. I think in a run situation, it would also be, it'd be very difficult to pull off first try. So, I'm not going to weigh in on the should it be allowed, should this be the new way of doing it argument, but I just wanted to show how it can be done and some of the things you can do to make it a bit easier to execute as well. So basically on this video, I've made I've got 2 recordings of the same strat, 2 different, well, it's basically the same method on each of the 2 attempts I did. But there is a slight difference, which I will explain in a second. But for now, I will just get it started. So the first part of this is nothing special going on. You're just navigating through the screen as you usually would. Just obviously avoid the enemies, don't take any unnecessary damage. This guy here is our first. He's our first key element of executing the strat properly. So what you want to do is you want to position Mega Man directly underneath him once he goes up. Reason for that is you just want him to go up, you want this enemy to go up and then come back down in more or less the same location he already is. That's just help with it's all part of setting him up for where you want him to be to help you get across the spike pit essentially. So you can see here, I walk underneath him once he goes up. I wait a little bit. So this is just where I'll just explain that. This is the reason why I've done 2 different recordings of this. You'll either get a situation like this first scenario, where he just goes up and you don't get any other enemies come down until, a few seconds later. But there's also a possibility when the sky starts going up in this sort of position, another enemy falls down. I think actually before this. So yeah, it changes the strat very slightly. So I'll show you that after I've done this first one. So you can see there's no other enemy, but at this point you can get RNG where another enemy would have fallen down already. But you can see he just pretty much, because I've paused underneath him, he just goes up and then goes down in more or less the same location he already was. So that's good, that's what you want. The next thing that you want to do to get him in the right position is if you move Mega Man around about this location here, so where he's just got 1 foot off the ledge, more or less, you want to do a diagonal jump, sort of in this direction where my mouse cursor is going. And that'll goad this enemy into jumping round about this spot here, and that's going to be a decent way to get your first D-boost over the spike pit. It's going to diagonal jump, land back here, and then the next key element of this is going to be as soon as I land, so you only want to be on here for a few frames after you land, then you want to jump again as soon as you land and take the D-boost off this enemy once he's in position. So you'll see how that plays out now. So I do the diagonal jump, angle myself back down, so I land on the edge of the platform again. Now you can see I already set off pretty much before he touched the spikes. So I've already jumped. So I'm going to get deboosted over to the right, which is good. That's just how it works by default in Mega Man 2. On this section, you always get pushed to the right. So now what you want to do, so as soon as you're in that damage animation, when you're taking the damage off of this guy, if you hold right on the D-pad, the next element to this is that you want this guy to land round about here where my mouse cursor is. Otherwise, if you're too slow in moving to the right, what will happen is this enemy might land around here, and then when he goes up for his next move, he's going to get blocked by this wall. So you've really got to hold right as soon as you come out of that damage animation. Make sure you've got Mega Man underneath this ceiling, so that the enemy follows you to also land under the ceiling. So you can see there, he just about snuck under the ceiling. I've jumped into him now before iframes are worn off. So that's that part of the strat. The other thing to point out is what I do across the spike pit is as soon as I take damage, this might sound a bit counterintuitive, but you can see on the D-pad I'm actually not holding right. So what I figured out is if you kind of keep Mega Man where he is, not for too long, but just for, I don't know, just for a few frames or so, it actually helps with the subsequent damage boosts you're going to be taking in terms of, making sure you're in the right position to get hits, basically. So I don't know if you'll see, but if you just pay attention to the fact that whenever I take a hit off of this guy, I'm actually leaving Mega Man where he is, so I'm keeping him stationary for a small amount of time before I start moving right. So you see there, I paused for a bit, then I started moving right. I do that after every hit from this guy. Again, stay stationary, then you move right. So at this point, you got 8 HP. Each hit off this guy does 4 damage. So when you've got this amount, you can take one more hit before you have to E-tank. It's going to take one more hit here. Now I know that I've got to pause, get the E-tank taken, otherwise I'm going to die off the next hit. Taking an E-tank. This is probably the hardest part of the whole strat, and it's just, as weird as it sounds, even though you haven't been on the spikes for very long at this point, you do get into a sort of a rhythm of, your iframes wearing off and knowing when to jump to take the deboost. You get into a rhythm by this point, and you know roughly how long your iframe is going to last. But because you have to pause now to get the E-tank taken, that gets, well, I feel it gets quite heavily disrupted by the fact you have to pause. So yeah, I haven't really figured out a way around that. It's just something you've got to cope with. And I feel like that's the hardest part of this entire strat personally, just that one section where you're having to pause, take the E-tank, and then sort of remember how much more iframes you've got left. But yeah, if you can do that, if you don't die at this point, and you can successfully take the next deboost after you've taken the E-tank, you'll probably make it to the end of this screen. But yeah, it's just knowing how long your iframe is going to last at that point. That's the difficult bit. The one thing I've kind of noticed as well, which may help some people, you can use a visual aid for knowing when this guy is going to, well, I suppose for knowing when to jump. So the enemy at this point, his peak is around about where my mouse cursor is. So it's, I don't know what you call these things in the background, but I guess it's pipe work of some sort. So sort of this line here of these pipes goes up to around that level, then he'll angle downwards into Mega Man. So if you try and jump maybe just before that, when you see him get to this point, when you see his propeller get to this point here, that might be a way of making this section a bit easier. So you can see I've jumped sort of just before his propeller gets to this line of pipework here, because he's going to pretty much in a few frames time he's going to angle downwards. He should meet Mega Man now, just as I'm arcing downwards from the jump. You'll see him do it again. You can see I've taken off now just as he's got past that line I was referring to. So he's sort of in between this set of pipework here. That's when you want to jump with Mega Man. So it might work if you use visual cues quite a lot. I think if you jump around that point, then that might help you. If you take a deboost at this point, around about where this ladder is, that should be the last deboost you need to take. So I would, at this point here, I would just run a little bit further. Then you can menu, switch to item 2 or item 1, if that's the way you want to do it. And then you should be able to reach this ladder here. So switch to item 2, jump on it, grab the ladder, and yeah, that's the screen done. So I've got one other example of me doing it as well. I won't really talk through this next one, because it's basically the same strat, but I'll just point out the difference here, which is with this enemy. So the first time I did it, he didn't, the other enemy didn't spawn, but sometimes you can get a pattern where the other one does spawn, and I believe you end up not using this guy to deboost you, but you end up using the second one that comes down. So if you just keep an eye out on that now, it's more or less the same strats, but you're just using a different enemy to do the deboosting off of. So you can see here, second enemy, just as I'm pausing underneath this first one, you've got a quick drop of this other enemy. So still doing the same thing, but you've just got to be ready for that as a possibility of that to happen, because yeah, otherwise if you get hit by this second dropping enemy, that's just going to mess up the strat completely. So just be ready to move in case this guy does come down. The other things I've said, they do apply still, in that you still want to get Mega Man close to the edge of this pit. You want to do a diagonal jump. You're going to see me come back onto the platform. Again, jump immediately after you land. You only want to be stationary for a few frames. But yeah, you should have one of the two enemies at least land in this sort of position again. and again, rest of the strat is just the same as before. You'll see I'm just pausing again after every hit. I'm just keeping Mega Man stationary for a few frames. Just helps with the timing. And again, you take a deboost around that point. That's the last one you need to take, and switch to item 2 and get to the end of the stage from there. So yeah, it's not an easy strat by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it is doable, and I think if you practice it, you can definitely get some level of consistency going with it. So yeah, that's just a few of the things I noticed anyway, so maybe that's helpful to some people. Hopefully it is.